Hello and welcome to my channel. Today I thought it might be useful for some of those of you who are new to watercolour to just go through some of the different watercolour techniques. So what I've done is a very simple flower, and I'm going to do a different technique on each petal just to show you how to use the watercolours. Now, you may recall in previous videos and blogs and things I've said really the most important thing about watercolour is practice, using them more, using them every day, getting to know your materials, your brushes, the amount of water that you need. So that really is the most important thing, but this is a good little exercise for you to find out which style suits you. Wet on dry, you might not be familiar with the terminology either, so I thought we'll go through that, the wet on wet and the wet on dry. But they suit different subjects and they suit different styles. So if you're a very precise painter and you want to have everything much more precise, you can perhaps use a wet on dry. If you want to be freer, you might want to use wet on wet. But this little exercise will help you decide which is best for you. So just set off by drawing a little simple flower with 6 petals. Now if I can find my brush, here it is. I've actually already got some colours made up, so I've just 3 colours. These are slightly thicker than these ones. This is Permanent Rose, Alizarin Crimson, and this is Alizarin Crimson with some Windsor Violet added. But the colours aren't really important, just, you know, perhaps 3 different tones in, you know, some pinks, or you could do them in yellows, whatever. So the first petal, I'm going to just do 1 layer on it, straight onto the dry paper and leave it to dry. And then I'm going to come back to that one later, we're going to put some more layers over the top of that. So when you're doing petals, you want a brush that's got a nice point to it. So this is just a synthetic brush, but it goes to a nice point at the end. And this is just an inexpensive watercolour pad. I think it's only £100 in weight, and it'll be a not pressed one. Okay, so I'm just going to completely leave that one to dry and go on to the second one. So this one, we're going to actually block the colours in. So we're just painting completely wet onto dry. So again, the paper's dry, and we're just going to block the colours in. And when you're doing it like this, very precisely, you need to leave each area to dry before you go on to the next area, so that you're not touching the colour and it running in. Oops, sorry, I've just kicked the tripod there. So again, I'm going to leave that bit to dry before I come back and do the next part. So we'll come back to all of these, and as you're going along, when you do it at home, write next to it what technique. So on each petal, get your pen out and write which technique you've used for each one. So the third petal, again we're going to be doing it in layers, so again I'm just going to do the first layer like we did on this one and then leave it to dry. And it should be drying quite quickly in here because it's the heater's on. It's a very cold day outside, so I've got all the heaters on in here, so things are drying quite quickly. Okay, so not much to look at so far because those are the wet on dry ones, so we're going to leave those to dry and come back to them. So the next one we're going to do onto wet paper. So get you a nice clean brush, clean water, and damp the whole petal. Now the effect you get with this is going to depend on just how much water you put on there. I've maybe got a little bit too much, so I'm just taking a bit off, so it's damp rather than wet. And then I'm going to put the pink on to begin with, all over. And you can see already how much more diffused and softer that looks compared to the ones that we've done up above. And then whilst that's still wet, I'm going to put the next layer on of colour, but it's a thicker layer, so there's less water in this pigment, And then the third layer again is thicker than the second layer, so more pigment and less water. And this is very important, and I know I've said it before in other videos, but for those of you that haven't seen the other videos, that's a very important tip to know. And just to get that line there, I'm just going to, that's with a dry brush, I'm just going to shape that line a bit there. Okay, so that was wet paper, wet paint, and wet paint. So that's completely wet in wet. The next one we're going to do straight onto dry paper, but the same thing, and just see how much difference it makes. So the first layer straight onto dry paper. Again, as you're doing it, write down what you've done. So with this one, write that you had the paper wet to begin with, and then the layers, and then on the next one write that your paper was dry, because you may not remember when it comes to the end of it which was which, and keep it for future reference. Then if there's a particular style that you like more than others, you can come back to it. So the second layer, again exactly the same paint as on this one, but see how it's not moving as much. On the third layer, some darks in there. I'm going to put the dark on the outside edge of this petal as well. And again, like I did before, just tidy that edge up with a brush a little bit, with a dry brush. Okay, so you can see they're slightly different there. This one hasn't moved out just as much into the other paint. A little bit neater, I think, that one than that one. And lastly, I was just going to do with this one just one colour, just to show you how you can make a really nice petal, because usually with flowers you have the light on the tips of the petals and darker towards the centre. So I'm just wetting the whole thing with clear water, and then I'm going to take this dark colour, the nice thick mix of the dark colour, and just put it into the end and allow it to move up the petal on its own. And you might want to just tilt your paper a little bit to let that flow. You can manipulate the wet paint slightly with your brush as well if you like. So you can see how you could just get a nice petal without any other colours, just popping in that one colour onto the wet paper and letting it flow. Okay, so those are your three wet in wet techniques. Onto wet paper and onto dry paper, and then just using it straight into the wet with one colour and allowing it to flow into that paper. So we're going to go back to the other three now. So that's completely dry. Now when you, actually it isn't, it's not far off. When you are checking to see whether the paper's dry or not, use the back of your hand, not the front. You've got oil in the tips of your fingers that will damage the paint, so just gently use the back of your hand. If it feels cool, then it's usually dry. Okay, so the next layer on this one, I'm going to use the alizarin. So when you're painting on top of paint that's dried, a good tip I once had was to imagine that you're painting on top of glass. So don't be scrubbing at the paper. So we've got wet paint on top of dry paint, and then I'm going to just use a damp brush. So squeeze the water out with your fingers and have a damp brush. Now if this brush was wet, the drier paint, if this is drier, than the amount of water you've got in your brush. What's going to happen when you put that brush on is that water is going to be pulled into that pigment, and then you end up with a mess. So you need it to be damp, not wet. And then just soften very gently the edge of where you've painted so that it blends in nicely, so you have not got a hard edge on that paper. Okay, so if you want to make a note next to that one, we've got wet paint on top of dry paint, and then we're softening the edge to blend it in. Now this one we were going back to blocking in the colours, and we'd set off with some pink, so we'll get the alizarin now. I'm just thinking it might be easier for you, I can't do it because of the camera and everything, but for you it might be a little bit easier just to actually turn your paper around at this point. Whenever you're painting, you sometimes find it easier to keep moving things around. Okay, and then we'll need to leave that colour to dry before we come back and put any more colour on. Whoops, can you see what I've done there? I've had my hand over it with not moving that paper around. See how this isn't that perfect, it's going back a little bit into there. I've actually got quite a cheap paper here. It's going to vary the results you get depending on how good your paper is. Okay, so the next one. Okay, so this one was going to be in layers, so that's completely dry now, and we're putting more paint on top of that. So I'm going to go with an alizarin, and this time I'm not going to soften the edges, I'm just going to leave them in lines. And then we're going to have to wait for that alizarin to dry before we come back and put the next layer on. So actually, while those are drying, I could do a little bit in the centre here, couldn't I? Now just look how this water's pooling here and making this cauliflower shape. Again, that's because it's not a brilliant paper, but on the other hand, it's quite pretty. So this is what I was saying before about getting to know your paper. So I've just done some dots in the centre here. I'm going to fill in with some yellow while some of that dries. And this is just straight from the pan. And then I'll get some green. Let that flow in, let it touch there, so that it mixes in together with the yellow. And then I'll get some of that darker colour and put some of that in as well. Let that flow down the stem a little bit as well. So all of those are just straight from the pan, just letting them flow in together, and touch the petals where they're wet so that they all looks like it's joined up. A little bit down here as well. So not quite dry, so what I'll do is I'll just pause for a moment, and then when it's dry I'll come back to you. Okay, so now these are dry, we can go ahead and put the extra colour in. Which I'll go for the darker version of that. again, you'd find it much easier to turn the paper around so that your hand wasn't leaning on the rest of your work. Okay, so it's not completely dry over here. Like I say, you can see where it's making these marks where, because it's a less expensive paper, it's cockling slightly, and because I put quite a lot of water on there, that water's gone into there, which is drawing the pigment in and making those shapes. That will be much smoother if we got a more expensive, heavier paper. So with most paintings that you do, what you'll find is as you go along and as you become more confident and more used to your own paints, papers and brushes and the amount of water that you're going to be using, you'll find that you actually use a combination of all these techniques depending on what effect you want. It's good when you're painting to have a variety of hard edges and soft edges to give some contrast to your painting, which makes it more interesting. So if you want some soft edges, you're going to be using these wet in wet techniques, and then some harder edges you're going to be using wet on dry to get edges like this. And having a combination of hard and soft lines within a painting is going to make it more interesting to look at. So if you look at something like this now, this is nearly dry. You've done that wet on wet, but then you may come back later and think, well actually I need a harder edge along here, and I'll just put some more over the top, and then you're painting wet onto dry. So you've got a combination of the two there. And similarly with this one, you might want to put the veins of the petal in or something like that and have a line on top. So don't forget, your watercolours are transparent and the other colours are going to come through from below, so you can keep building them up. So make a note of which petals you like the best when you've done yours, and write, as I said, write how you've done them so that you'll remember another time, because we always think that we're going to remember and we don't. So just write next to each petal what you've done and what you like and what's worked well. Okay, so I hope you found that useful. If you want to put some comments below for each other to say what your hints and tips are for getting to know your watercolours, then it's always good for each other to have a look at those comments. And I shall probably put this in a blog as well when I get the time, so if you want to go over to my blog page, I'll put the link to that at the end as well. Okay, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you again soon. Bye for now.